Camila and I have had the absolute pleasure of getting to know each other prior to our fireside chat today. And I gotta tell you, I'm so excited for our community members to be able to get a ton of inspiration from this wonderful woman who's sharing her time, her stories, and her expertise. So I'm going to say the quickest intro, but I'd like to welcome Camila Gargantini, current Chief of Staff at Oyster HR. Camila, mic's off to you. Tell us a little bit
Thank
more
you.
about yourself.
So I'll start with a quick introduction just about my background and what I'm doing, and then we can get over to the questions that the conversation that we want to have. So for context, I am currently the Chief of Staff to the COO, and also have been the interim Chief of Staff to the CEO at Oyster. So I've been playing double duties for the past just over 3 months. And this is actually my handoff week. It's the official week when I'm giving the duties back to the Chief of Staff as it just returned from parental leave. With that said, prior to this role, I was the Chief of Staff to the Chief People Officer here at Oyster, but I actually joined Oyster in product operations. I previously used to do product management. I worked in very early stage, like seed round type of companies where I was the first or second hire. That was my experience building technology from, greenfield kind of deal. And prior to that, I had a career in both project management, business operation, but also education. I originally have a fine arts degree, which is so random. But I have training in HR management. I have certification on that. I have done Scrum training, product management training, learning experience, and I'm starting a master certification in organizational health and change at the end of this month. So that's a little snippet into me. We
Just
can
a
go
little
from
bit,
here.
right, Camila? Just a tiny bit. As we all probably heard the wonderful different hats that Camila gets to wear, I think it's safe to say she definitely is a chief of staff. So that we can all relate on. So for everyone here today, the way we'll host our fireside chat, I'll ask a couple of questions to kind of give us an understanding of who Camila is, what's her journey to being a chief of staff, and also really how her role has allowed her to essentially increase organizational cohesion, and how her role has also allowed her to be the best at what she is when it comes to managing different teams and building teams and that cohesion. So with that said, we will have time for lots of questions at the end. So if you do have a question that does come up as you're listening to us, just have a fun fireside chat, please go ahead and add it to I'm in Slack right now. Please go ahead and add it to the group chat here in Zoom, and we will get to it. Or feel free to also just like unmute yourself during our Q&A time later on and ask that question too. Just to make sure everyone's still here with us, give us a thumbs up or reaction just to make sure we're all good and ready to go. All right, you see thumbs up. Camila, I cannot empathize enough on just being able to wear different hats. Tell us, how did you actually become a chief of staff at Oyster? Like, what is that story?
I would say that it's a little bit of foresight and me thinking about what's next for me, but just being at the right place at the right time, and with the right people. Like I said, I started at Oyster in product operations. I was a senior product operations. I was the first hire for that team that was focusing on optimizing how the product management function worked. As soon as I joined, just for context for everyone here, at the time I joined Oyster, it was 220 people, and within 6 months we were almost 700. So the exponential growth was terrifying because every week we would get 30 to 40 new people joining the company. So it was very hard to keep up and scaling the processes. And I realized that what I was doing in product could be beneficial for the entire company. Shortly after, I've been there for I think about 4 or 5 months. Our chief people officer at the time did a Ask Me Anything session. And he was talking about how he viewed the company. He viewed Oyster as a product, and he viewed the employees as users of that product. And for him, it was very important that he built the HR function in a way that the user experience came first. And when he said that, being somebody coming from product management, I was like, I resonate with this guy. I'm like, I need to help amplify his message in the product function, because I saw that there were already some, not necessarily conflicts, but like misunderstanding of how products should operate and how other more traditional functions perceived the way of operating from a product perspective. So I said, if I can help magnify that approach to it, maybe we can find some cohesion. At the same time, interestingly, we had just hired a president, and she was looking for a chief of staff. And I considered applying for the job, but I didn't. And instead, I applied to a job as a program manager in the people team. That was my entryway to becoming a chief of staff, because what happened was I worked with that team for 6 months, improving their operations. And I had just done a sync with the chief people officer, saying to him, like, here are the things that we need to do with this function to take us to the next level to scale. And the following week was when the company decided to do a reorg, and they had to do it very quickly. We had 6 weeks to execute on that. And he saw the work that I had delivered, and he came to me and said, I need you to program manage that. Um, so all of a sudden, I went from being a program manager in the people function to being the proxy and overseer of that project from an execution perspective. So we ran the reorg in January 11th, was the day that it took place last year. And shortly after that, he decided to make myself his chief people officer. And that's how I entered the role. And then I evolved into chief operating officer, chief of staff, and then now interim to the CEO.
Wow. So one thing that like I was really hearing here is how you magnified the vision of your principal, right? Of a principal, whether it's the chief people officer or it's your current COO that you currently work with. What I'm really hearing is like it's all about amplifying kind of their vision and mission and finding ways to really get the rest of the teams within your organization to be aligned with that. Do you have any sort of strategies with really tying in the big picture visions that our principals create and share with us back to the rest of the team, kind of similar to how you magnified it for your product operations team?
One of the things that I focus mostly on is language and terminology. And as an immigrant, I am originally from Brazil, lived there for 20 years, immigrated to Canada, spoke very little English. I actually came to Canada with no money in my pocket. I met a boy and I married him, and we've been together for 21 years. But I came here without knowing the language, without understanding the culture. And I realized that a lot of my struggles professionally was because of language. And I always felt very alienated when I was talking to people from sales, and they would use jargon that I didn't understand. Pipeline, SQLs, like, and every function has,
MQLs.
yes, every function has some kind of terminology that alienates somebody else, right? So I think I took that approach from when I did product management, because my role was to be able to connect product design and engineering to translate for each other, right? What am I talking about, and how can I actually interact with people in engineering and design and make sure that we're on the same page? And what I decided to do is that I look at language. I need to use common knowledge in language that everybody understands. And I am also a very politically inclined person. I like to look at dynamics that politics and capitalism and society brings to how we operate and behave. And ultimately, I believe that when we use alienating language, it's very hard for people to connect, and you create this idea of the other. And by connecting people through language that is understandable to everyone, it makes it so much easier for them to see your perspective. So I try to use that. And sometimes it might come like people might look at me and think you're like a newbie, or you're like an amateur, or you talk very like casually. And I'm like, I'm sorry, if you're going to judge me on that, that's on you. I can't take that responsibility. But ultimately, it's about how I speak to people and make it relatable, because honestly, and I think I said that to you when we talked on our call, it's just like ultimately people just want to be heard and feel like they understand and connect with others. And the role of a chief of staff is to be that connector. And I think language is a very powerful tool to do that.
I 1000% resonate with that. And as chief of staffs, I do feel like it's also it's this unspoken yet very much in our job description to be that connector, to also be the translator across the business language and also just our everyday language as human beings, right? To your point, I also agree with you. I think, something I've always believed in is that people want to be listened to and understood. And the way to connect is to find that shared language. So I appreciate you giving light to how you find ways to magnify and, tie in the big picture with people like your teammates. So with
Yeah.
that, I'm curious, like, do you have any particular fun stories to share with us on, what you're currently doing right now as a chief of staff? Since we know you wear multiple hats, you've got a lot of things going on. If I recall, you're also in London right now for an offsite. And as chief of staffs, we're very, how many of us are familiar with offsites? Everyone? I'll raise my hand for everyone. Yep, there you go. Yeah, so because you are wearing multiple hats, tell us, like, what's one thing that you're looking forward to working on, or a particular challenge at work that you're excited to solve as a chief of staff?
This is very
One
recent,
problem, right?
and
One
yeah,
problem.
one of the many problems. But honestly, I don't look at anything as a problem. I believe everything is just an evolution. I don't think anything in the world gets solved. There is no end state, and I think partially the problem is that people look for an end state, and like things never end. Life is always changing and always evolving. So for me, what I'm really excited about right now is that I have for 3 years almost. I've been here for almost 3 years, been involved in some capacity to how we do planning. It started in product operations and then it moved from the people team. So always about like how are we defining our goals, how are we defining a strategy. And I feel like for 3 years, I've been beating the same drum about we need to do this better. We need to optimize. We need to bring people on the journey. And because I got to cover for the chief of staff to the CEO, I got the CEO's ears. And I said, here are the things I've observed as I worked in all of these functions for the past 2.5 years. And I think here are the things that we need to change. And in comparison to how we did the offsite last year we actually did we had 3 different offsites taking place within 4 weeks of each other. They were done all independently by the leader of the function. And there was no connection or intentional follow through of like this one is informing this one, that it's informing that one. They were all created independently in silos. So what happened was we reached December and we're just like trying to figure out what our strategy was. And there was all of these layers and threads that started in different offsites, but they didn't connect together. So we struggled to be like, what is the message? What, like, we had a sense of what the strategy was, but there was a lack of clarity and cohesion for the rest of the company on how we communicated that. People who were close to the process, they understood, but the ones that weren't, it was very hard for us to communicate. So that brings me to why I'm in London. I got to be the one organizing the offsite. So this is a very scary thing because this is my first time organizing an offsite for 11 executives and Oyster is a fully distributed company. We have employees in 65 different countries. I have 5 of us coming from North America. I have 4 of us coming from Europe and 1 in the Middle East, meeting in Barcelona, actually. So I am going to Barcelona on Saturday, and the offsite is going to be in Barcelona. But I chose to come to London because there's a lot of our employees here, and I wanted to meet them. So I'm very excited about the fact that the CEO trusted me to do this earlier. And also, I said to him, I'm like, I think it's important that we don't necessarily limit this to C-level executives, because oftentimes we were referring to the strategic planning for the annual, like the following year, as a C-level planning. And I was like, even the terminology there, if we just say C-level, people think that only C-level executives are allowed to be doing that planning. And I said, it's not about the members of the group, it's about the strategic areas and functions that need to have representation and a voice when we're having these conversations. So I made sure to include the VP of people to the SVP of marketing, because otherwise we would have to trust the principal that they report to be their voice. And it's just, I think, unrealistic to expect a C-level executive to be able to have the knowledge and the breadth for all of the functions that they oversee. So I'm very excited and proud that I was able to make this happen differently, but I'm terrified because I'm actually facilitating the session. And, ultimately, when you're facilitating for a group that needs to come together and work better together, but when you as an individual also have an opinion on the content, but you need to play a facilitator role, it's very hard to stay objective. And it's going to be a good exercise for me to look at the group as an outsider and be very explicit when it's my time to contribute to the conversation versus tell them that they need to sort it out together.
I hear you on that. That is so tough actually. And I think some of us here have led and facilitated our own share of offsites or at least team meetings where, we're not only facilitating conversations to be organic, to be fruitful, and not only are we trying to also make sure we're including everyone in the conversation, but to your point, yeah, we also have opinions too. Like being chief of staffs, we get the privilege of being able to understand all the inner workings of the organization in the best way. And so I hear you on just like the struggle of navigating and how scary it is to also navigate. So I'm crossing my fingers for you, Camila, because I have a feeling it'll run very smoothly. And on that note, I mean, I love that you're essentially walking the walk and talking the talk as well, to your point of making sure that we're not othering in our conversations. And I love that you were able to identify, the use of like C-suite level executives and being able to bring in your VP of people to the conversation, really ensuring that key stakeholders are included in these really important decisions that get made that affect a whole business. So on that note, something that I think I struggle with. I'm saying we, but I struggle as a chief of staff is, how do I essentially, if we have a executive who may have a differing opinion or vision on the strategy, and we have someone who is one of their direct reports or a cross-functional partner of ours as chief of staff, how do you bridge that, connection? How do we help increase the cohesion amongst decision
Mm.
makers? Do you have any tips for that? I struggle with it, so I'll take any tips.
So the approach to everything in my life is that I do not point to the problems. I don't assign blame. What I do, and the analogy that I use is that I turn on the lights and I let people see them for themselves. So if I'm having an issue where I clearly see that this person has a position, this one has another position, I'm not going to say I'm like, you're right, and give them my position so now they can see me as an ally to have a fight with this other person, because that's not my role. And I think that just makes the dynamic worse. What I do is, one, ask for clarification, because oftentimes people will say what they think from their perspective and they forget, again, alienating other people, assuming that people know the same thing that they know. So what I try to do is get them to answer questions that will actually answer the question that I know that the other person has without actually
Form of
saying, oh,
validation.
but this person, it's kind of like, hey, just tell me more about it. I think, again, when you show curiosity to understand why somebody's saying something, it kind of just drives the conversation a little bit more organically. And I'll give you an example. We did have a situation recently where there was a presentation that was shared, there was a deck. Everybody looked at it, and I noticed that most people didn't ask clarifying questions. And I said, this is not going to go well, because I know that there is a discrepancy on the data somewhere here, because I had conversations with some of these people and they were referring to a different number. But I guarantee you that they're going to be afraid of confronting the person on the spot, because it's a vulnerable situation. And it's like, hey, your data is wrong, right? So me as a neutral party, in a sense, as a facilitator, I'm just like, hey, can you just tell me where that source is? Because when I look at my numbers from this end, and I gave them the source, I said, I can look at this place and the number is different. So can you just understand and tell me where your number is coming from? So that gives permission for other people to feel like they can ask those questions too. And it's very much something that I use as well in my life as a philosophy. Is like, there is a saying from Nelson Mandela that he says that when you share, I'm going to paraphrase very poorly here, but essentially when you share your struggles with others, you give them the opportunity to do the same, right? So you're empowering people to just share their own vulnerabilities. And I'm like, I have no qualms and no issues in looking like a fool if that will make things better for everybody else, because my personal mission in life is just bring some joy to life, because life is already hard enough in its own. And like, you know what? I don't take anything too seriously, but I take everything seriously. And I think it's a balance of finding when it's time to do this versus that. And as I mentioned to you before, I am a gelatinous blob. I need to adapt myself to the team I work with, the needs of the business at a time, and just figure out how to go from there.
I love that. And I absolutely resonate. I think I in particular, I have to highlight your phrase, gelatinous blob. I think that is a phrase I have not yet heard when describing the chief of staff role, but really that's what it is, right? We absorb different types of information, different types of leadership styles. We see best practices left and right, and we also see bad examples that we choose not to absorb too. And so on that note of being a gelatinous, wonderful blob, what's a moment in your career, your wondrous career, especially as a chief of staff now, to the COO, and now about to be, well, you are currently a chief of staff also to this interim CEO, right, at the moment.
Yep.
So what's a moment that you're proud of that you did recently?
I have to say this is weird because it feels a little weird generally to say that I am proud of the two reorgs that I ran. Because I think I can still feel proud of how we executed. I have experienced reorgs before. I have experienced acquisitions and layoffs. I've been laid off before. So I always had the experience from the other side. But I was so proud of the fact that we were able to execute these two reorgs, and they were almost like only about 6 months or 7 months apart. One was in January, the other was in September. We did two, and overall, the feedback was mostly positive. Of course, there were some little, bumps in the road, but if we were to compare how we did this and how most companies tend to treat their employees, I think we raised the bar on what a layoff could look like, even though it's a negative thing in the experience of the employees. Ultimately, this is a business. Ultimately, we are in a VC capital world where we are, what I usually say is in the bed with the devil. You know what I mean? Unfortunately, there is depression that comes. It's the money, it's all of that. But I think we need to be realistic that this is a business, right? And ultimately, the business is made out of people. And I think that was a really proud moment for me, because not only were we able to consider the impact from a global perspective, because like you can easily fire somebody in the United States, you cannot do the same thing in France, you cannot do the same thing in the UK. There are very complex legislation that we have to follow. So for example, in the UK, if they have worked with us for more than 2 years, we need to actually offer them a 30-day consultation period where you have to allow them to review and apply for any of the open roles you have in the company. You have to do that legally. So like, how can I do that for the UK employees and not do that for the US employees? So it was really important for us to create a fair experience for the entire group. And we unfortunately had to let go of 20 people in 25 different countries. So that was a really proud moment in my career. And I really hope I don't ever have to do another one. But if I do have to do another one, I will take on the challenge, and I will just make sure that it's even better than the last.
And I have to tell you, I think conversations on reorganizations, layoffs, rifts are always so difficult to have, and they're uncomfortable conversations. And I love that at the core of it, you're seeing the different lenses of the situation. And it also sounds like you're putting the people at the top, at top of mind when it comes to creating any sort of processes or policies for the business. And so with that said, I'm curious, earlier you mentioned that the business is made out of people. And I think something you and I both agree on is people want to feel listened to and understood. And so with that said, what are some other ways that we as chief of staffs can really see the human with whoever we talk to at work, or see the human side of all that we do, despite being ridiculously busy as chief of staffs? How do we remember that? How do we retain that always? How do we always keep the human side at the forefront of all that we do as chief of staffs?
I think it's simple if we think about ourselves and it's just like, how would I feel if that was happening to me, right? And hopefully you're not a terrible human that that you're like, I wouldn't care, hopefully you're not that, because oftentimes people do care when it impacts themselves, right? And it's about empathy. It is, and asking the question, how would I perceive that if that was happening to me? And how can I make that more relatable and honestly just understood? I find, I have to say, being married for 21 years has taught me a lot about communication. And a lot of my issues at the beginning were just the fact that the first year, 2 years, because I didn't speak English, I was lost in translation. My husband would say things in Portuguese to me in Portuguese that he thought was nice, and it was like vulgar or like really offensive. And I was like, what the heck is going on? And I was like, this guy doesn't know what the hell is going on. And then it was just me understanding like jargon and how people were talking to each other. And I realized that focusing on how you communicate and really be attentive to and this takes work. The problem is that it takes work. It's acknowledging and recognizing how the other person is. So like if I were to look at a very high level, looking at culture in the US versus in specific countries in Europe and in Brazil or whatever, right? There is very different approaches to communication and culture. And I think as a chief of staff, you can think about that, but like on a smaller scale. It's like, again, how do salespeople tend to show up versus product people versus, finance people? And not necessarily just saying, oh, all finance people are like that, because ultimately it's about the human, right? And being like, they might have other things, either trauma from previous jobs or insecurities for themselves. They're like, we all do have it. Like, you know what I mean? But like, why worry about it and get caught up on the emotions and be like, what's the worst that can happen if you're just vulnerable and you ask questions and you're curious and you just have a human conversation with people? So, I think to me, it just comes as second nature and just being like, we're all humans. And also the work that I'm doing, I'm not saving lives. So like, it's not like I'm a doctor or like, a first responder somewhere that I think has a very different way to. But ultimately, it's just like, what is eh, eh, how do I feel about this action that I'm taking and how is it impacting the people that I'm taking that action towards, right? It's empathy. It's hard. Some people don't have it. It doesn't come easily. I was not like this 10, 12 years ago. I was not as empathetic as I am today.
I have to admit, I'm shook. Like, what? I mean, I have to say, Camila, to be fair, you and I, the privilege I get of getting to know you in our last call together and today, I'm very surprised. And I think I also want to recognize you for the work that you also did to increase your skills and empathy and being able to always see people as how they want to be seen and understood. And so I also want to recognize you for that because I also know that that's a lot of mental and emotional gymnastics. I recognize, I very much empathize. And so on that note, because I'm just reeling from what an inspiration you are as a chief of staff, thank you for being honest with us also about just the real problems that you're actually solving as a chief of staff right now at Oyster. And thank you for also giving us the global lens too, because I do think for me, I work with a Philippines-based founder and I work with a US-based founder, and both are so different in terms of
Different.
how I communicate with them and how I work with them. And so I love the global lens you put. I don't know if I ever mentioned I'm like 4'9", and so like I'm always reminded that like the world is so much bigger, always. Anyways, on that note, do you have any other lasting advice for us aspiring and current chief of staffs?
I have to say that two things that I've read in the past year or that I'm currently reading have really informed where I'm operating from. It's there's two specific books. One it's called The Culture Map, and the second one is The Skilled Facilitator. Um, I decided to read the skilled facilitator because of having to facilitate the offsite. Even though I have been an instructor and teacher, I did this for 12 years in the past as well. I used to teach photography, and I'm very well versed in just teaching in general. But this is a facilitation, which is a difference from being a trainer. So speaking to these two things, I'm I think it really drove home the need for me to be aware from that cultural lens that you were talking about, like the global lens to it, because I realized that being a Brazilian person operating in Canada, Canada is like this conflicted country that doesn't know if we want to be like the US or France or UK. And then we have all of the immigrants that kind of like blend it all in. And it's very confusing to know, like, and some people really stick with their culture. But I realized that a lot of the problems that I was having in communication was just related to, I would say, like, factors such as hierarchy. Are you an egalitarian leader versus a hierarchical, and where we sit in the spectrum? How do you communicate? Are you a high context versus low context culture? Like in Brazil, we have the tendency of reading in between the lines quite a lot. We make a lot of assumptions of what people are saying just based on cues. In Japan, for example, they are the most high context country ever in this book, how she defined it, as that, like, depending on the phrase, they might be saying the same word may mean leg or arm, something like a leg or foot. And it's just like, you need to understand the context to know what that means. And that really informed the way that I have these conversations with individuals. And the skilled facilitator, on the other hand, was really about playing the role of making the group be better together, right? And it's just like taking the approach of, they talk about like I forgot the name now, but it's like the single-minded approach where you become defensive and you want to hold your position versus having a learning mindset. And that really has opened my mind on how to approach everything that I'm doing right now. That being said, look at me. I just went into a whole tangent in my head and I forgot what your question was. So that's where I'm at. And
Chief
if I
of staff
didn't
life,
answer
no?
it, I will ask you to tell me what it was again to make sure that I give you an answer. Yeah.
No, that was amazing. Thank you. Thank you for sharing two wonderful books with us. I actually, I put in the chat, hopefully these are the correct ones, Skilled Facilitator and Erin Meyer's The Culture Map for
Yeah.
our community to take a look at. And actually, Camila, that counts as advice. So thank you for sharing with us very great resources in the form of books to check out when it comes to really increasing our global lens and frankly, our empathy. And so on that note, I do want to open up the conversation to the rest of the community to see if they have any questions. I've been asking my questions, so I want to make sure I also show up for the rest of the community and stop talking now so I can open up the floor. And feel free to unmute yourself or ask a question in the chat.
I have a question, Camilla. And first off, thank you for all of the great gems that you've shared. It resonates, and I wholeheartedly agree. Empathy and curiosity are two very important skills in our jobs. How have you handled like growing? So not just reorgs or rifts, but the opposite too of growing. And how are you able to oversee massive growth, like from a series A to B or B to C? Like, do you have any advice on the growth aspect too?
Ah, I have been operating. I'm like, one thing that I have to give myself credit for. I don't know what it is in my brain. I have this ability to plan really far and then walk back and like figured out the steps to go there. I think there was a conversation I had with an engineer at some point when I was in my first product job that he said, let's talk about what the end goal is, like what is the big goal, and let's break it down in like compartments. So when I think about scaling, it's just like, I think a lot of the times it can be difficult for more like middle management or even ICs to think and see the future far. And like when you're scaling, right? It's just like you're so caught up on thinking about the scaling that sometimes you forget where you're going. So I like to always have like the plan, and it might be like, I want it to look like this 2 years from now. Because if I don't have that target, even though it might change, I might go in a completely different direction and pivot, but that's fine. I just need to know where I'm going so I can define the steps. And in the growth, what I think a lot of companies get lost in is that they're only thinking about the growth, but they're not thinking about how does the growth creates demand on the people? How does the demand on the people impact how they show up? How the way that they show up impact the quality of the way that they are performing. It's just like it's a trickle down effect of scalability. And honestly, oftentimes people equate scaling with automation, which I believe it's a flaw because ultimately when you automate something so much, if one little thing breaks, it tends to break the whole thing. So I think finding the balance between when is it time to actually automate versus like this should never be automated, or maybe automating temporarily just for, you know, the next 6 months, and then maybe 6 months from now you have to pivot completely and you change the direction, right? And it's just thinking ahead enough in the way you are organizing your thoughts and like to have that vision. But here's a problem that I find with my way of thinking about everything. This scares the hell out of people because as a systems thinker, I cannot translate this big picture vision in a way that is consumable to other people. So they see myself when I meet somebody new. They think, oh, Camila's just having her grand idea. She wants to change everything. She's gonna come in like the bull in a china shop. And I'm like, that's who I am. I have big visions. But like, I actually just want to start small with like maybe we just share one tiny little template for something. Like, I'm not trying to change the world overnight. And at first, people would see myself as like either threatening or like she's crazy. She is like trying to do more than she's getting in everybody's lane. It was just like a threatening position for me to be in. And I decided, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not saving lives, one day at a time. And I really take that approach of like 1% increase every day. James Clear, Atomic Habits. If you haven't read it, read it. It was great to just think about like everything we do has a consequence, and scalability at any cost has a cost, has a serious cost in the culture, in the people. And to me, I truly believe in nurturing talent to avoid the cost of knowledge loss over time, because I believe that the power is on the people. And just on that, I just want to finish this thought process with saying one thing that I really try to do as a chief of staff is hold everyone accountable. When they say, like, I will be talking to a leader and they say, but they should do this. And then they're referring to the company. The company should do that. I'm like, you are the leader of this company. There is no God or entity out there that is going to tell you what to do. You're the one doing it. So like, why are you not taking accountability for that? It's your responsibility to do that. And that can be very threatening and very uncomfortable. But you know,
Yeah,
you have
and
to
it
do it.
ties back to your language comment too. Like they keep saying they when they could make it an I
They,
statement. I. Yeah, thank you very much. That's very
you're
insightful.
welcome.
Yeah, one thing that I noticed, I'm also from Brazil. That's why I was like, yay, another Brazilian here. Uh, and I don't know, I'm from Rio Grande do Sul, and we are pretty straightforward. And sometimes, like, even like when I was working with people from São Paulo, like the agencies that I was working, they were all São Paulo, they felt like that I was threatening for them too, just by the way that the way that I grew up. Like I grew up like being straightforward, like this is we call like faca na bota. It's kind of like, oh yeah, you have a knife on your boot, you're ready to shoot that. So and I remember when I brought Disc to Finland because we were 80% immigrants at a certain time. We had just the two co-founders, Americans, and everybody else was immigrants, but like immigrants from Austria, from Africa, Congo, Canada, Honduras. We had people from everywhere. And the disc assessment brought a lot of these things about, when you are like straightforward, or you're more like a cheerful one, or you're more like a analytical one. So the way that people talk and express themselves, and that was like a life changer for us because it kind of like leveled everybody on the same level of conversation.
Yeah.
And I think, and also I think as an immigrant, I also think that we have to take advantage of this, and most of companies, they don't know how to. So yeah, everything that you were telling here like resonated a lot with me.
Yeah, and I think what you were saying about leveling people and bringing everybody to the same, like, you couldn't refer to that, like making sure that people are all operating from the same source of truth, making sure that
Yeah.
we're all using the same vocabulary, the problem that I observe, that I see that happens over and over again in every company and the chief of staff has to often deal with, is that when you hire a new executive, they will bring to that company their experience. So they'll say, I did that before, I'm just going to do that here. So they bring their tools, they bring their thinking, they bring their way of building, but they are not considering the dynamic that exists and
Yeah.
how that needs to function with the rest of the group. So I think that the biggest mistake that a chief of staff can do is assuming that whatever they did before can be done again. And honestly, this is a life lesson, guys. This is not just for business. This is for relationships. This is for anything you do. Like, you can't expect what works somewhere else to work here. And like, even when it comes to frameworks, we talk about frameworks, and like, I get so angry about people being like, let's use the squad model from Spotify. And I'm like, you dummies.
Yeah.
Not even Spotify uses that. And everything. And even like talking about best practices, that actually triggers me. Because best practices based on what? First of all, that's the first question I asked. For whom?
Yeah.
In what scenario? Who were the people there? What was the culture? What was the company? What they wanted to do? None of that is ever equal. So even best practices, that's when innovation happens, right? Nothing is new in this world. We use a best practice as a starting point, and then we build what works for the group that you're with, right? So
Yeah.
for me at Oyster, what I'm really pushing us to do is build the Oyster way, the Oyster way of communicating, the Oyster way of planning. It's not about looking at how a different company planned and try to do the same thing here, because it's not going to work. And
Yeah.
then it's just
Yeah.
wasteful.
Yeah. We had a consultant that he was like the VP, not the VP, the president for McDonald's Arco Dorados in Brazil and Colombia and Bolivia. And he would try to bring the processes that he had at McDonald's and Google, to a company that we were like 20 people. And I had like huge arguments with him because I was like, I'm not gonna bring this here because we are not at the stage, where 20 people, we're not like 1,000 something company.
Yeah.
So
And
yeah.
it's interesting we're having this conversation because I struggle with when hiring puts a lot of weight on previous experience based on where people worked. Because like, the whole thing, like an ex-Facebook, an ex-Fang, I'm like, okay, are you trying to be next Fang? Are you trying to be Facebook? Because if you're trying to do that, maybe, but even then it's not going to work because it's a different company, right? And I think
Yeah.
to me, the best way to judge or select or figure it out, it's literally just go back to basic human principles on how people operate. What are the needs of human beings? Like, because it's common, even with the cultural differences. Ultimately, we have a core of things that I could say that it's true for every human. And ultimately goes back to connection. Like, we are social beings. It's about building that connection. And again, I think there is a lot of power and a lot of responsibility with the role of a chief of staff that gets undervalued, overlooked, and it can become a thankless job if people relegate that role to just be a admin function. And I think that the power of having a chief of staff that thinks about how to be that integrator can be super powerful, because now you're helping to make the function that you support better, but also making sure that you're making your principal better. With that, I'm going to just tell you a quick side story here. I was having a struggle a little bit with my role, because I was telling my principal, I'm like, I feel like I'm not doing things. I'm not checking the boxes, because I was a very execution focused person. And in the chief of staff role, the things that I work on are long tail. They go on forever. They take forever they're never done. Right. And then he looked at me and said, Camila, your job is what you do really well. You call it out, you name it, you put pressure, and you strive for excellence. It's like, that's my job. It's like, I'm just forcing everybody to be better at what they do together. And that is mentally exhausting. And I
Yeah.
want to take a nap just talking about it. It's just like, it's exhausting.
It is. And I hear you. I'm like, I thank you for also making us feel very seen and heard. I really appreciate it. I think it's important to talk about the the side that always doesn't really get talked about, which is like the mental load it actually takes to navigate relationships, to translate across the different domains of a business, and to also bring people together. And I love the layer that you just added, the additional nuance of we as chief of staffs make people better together. And that's hard. Mic drop. It's just hard. So on that note, thank you so much for relating on the chief of staff role. And frankly, I think we all know the chief of staff role is so bespoke. There's so many different types of chief of staffs, but I think the feelings and what we experience as chief of staffs, there really is a single thread. And I think, Camila, you put it really well. You articulated it so simply. We make people better together. And I think that's a beautiful note to end on. And on that note, if anyone has any other questions, we can probably take one or two more. And I'd like to also highlight Camila's LinkedIn, which I'll share in the chat. So please, please, please feel free to follow her and connect with her on LinkedIn as well. And so in case there's anyone else who has one or two more questions, now is the time.
I think Angie had something before.
I mean, I always do.
Yes.
Camila, just your gold. Everything you say is fantastic. When I asked the question about scaling, you had mentioned that scaling scares people, and that's true. And then you said that sometimes you can come across as crazy or threatening, and that's like the last thing we need to be perceived as a chief of staff. How did you overcome that as when you were first starting out? How did you overcome having that persona or have it being applied to you? How did you create those connections?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think I am in a very unique situation that I started from within. I had built relationships in the product team. In the product team, I worked closely with a lot of people, so people knew me. And I am the kind of person that wants to have fun. I told my husband that for my next job, when I am interviewing for my next job, one of the questions I'm going to ask is like, how the heck do we have fun here? Because I like to do social calls. Like when I travel, just for personal travel, I want to meet with my coworkers. All of my best friends were people I met at work. And I think that there is this narrative of separating life and work, but ultimately, like I said, it's about people, right? And I make a point to get to know the individuals. And I don't know, again, if it's how my brain works, but every time I have a conversation with anybody, if I meet somebody new, my brain is constantly looking for connections. We'll say like, I'm from Brazil, like Guadalupe just went like, yes, in Brazil. I'm like, we have something in common. We already feel closer because of that, right? And like in every interaction I have, it feels like my brain is just constantly scanning. They say something about like, I don't know, I had a call that went like this, somebody at Oyster. They're like, oh, I'm in Ireland. I'm like, oh my God, I just read a book about the Irish Easter thing, like a revolution there. And I'm like, and they started talking about it. And it's just like, suddenly we felt closer, right? And like I said, I am lucky that I started from within. Would I ever, like, if my next job, would I actually apply for a chief of staff in a company that I've never worked in? I am actually quite sure. Unless it's like an executive that I've worked closely with and they just carry me along with them. I'm like, I told Mark, I'm like, I feel like I'm stuck to you. I'm like stuck to like hip to hip. I'm like, where you go, I go. I'm just like, we're a two package deal. You know what I mean? Because it's just like the dynamic exists. And I think it can be really one, terrifying, but also because of cultural expectations, how we work as a society, there is a hierarchy and a power dynamic that comes when you come in as a chief of staff. People look at it and think that, and when I say people that I'm chief of staff, I'm like, guys, it's just a title. That doesn't mean I'm actually a very approachable person. So I try to like, again, bring it down to a level that people understand. And then when I explain what I say, like what I do, they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. But like people associate chief of staff with like military, a very like proper thing, like president, like the White House. And it's like, it's not that. So I think just translating, explaining the job from the people perspective, and would make it easier. But I don't know. I don't know if it's as easy. I don't know that that's relevant if you're just applying to a job that is the first chief of staff job like at this company, and I don't know how that would be. And I know it's terrifying because people are going to have a certain expectation of you coming in that role. But again, I'm going to have to say it: get to know people, make time, be intentional about these conversations. Here's something really small that I did. At Oyster, we have a better idea of the day channel. And somebody went like this in the channel and said, my idea is we should create a channel in Slack that it's called Social Yell. And I saw that and I replied and I said, why don't you go and create it? And they were like, oh no, I'm like, I shouldn't do it. I'm like, don't worry, I'll create it for you. So I was like, I just created the channel because they were terrified of doing it. And I'm like, I don't care if somebody calls me out, I'll just delete it. So I created Social Yell and people started joining and then people started yelling. And then suddenly the CEO found out about it. And there were rules like if you don't yell, if you use lower caps, you go to jail. Then I created a Slack jail, which was a private channel that people got tossed into social, the social jail, and they would stay there until they actually did some stuff. So I took some time to create an activity to just like bring people together, and it became this thing. Eventually, it's dying off now. Now the only people that are complaining there about something that went wrong in their life or they're angry at a customer. But like in the beginning was that moment for us to come together. So people now know me because of the social yell, right? And it's just like I always look for those opportunities for people to see the human behind the title because ultimately that's all I am. So I don't know. Get creative. Get creative.
That's great. Thank you. And it goes back into your common language and being intentional. And you talked about assumptions too and how dangerous they are. And so by telling people what you do and translating who you are in the company and how you fit in there, and it's not this scary thing, you're actually removing their ability to make an assumption about you that may or may not be true.
And I'll tell you where this is anchored in, and I'm going to talk back about the trauma, right? I think ultimately I, as a human being, had trauma from childhood of feeling that my parents never told me what was going on. I always felt that it's just like I would find out about something like last minute, or like it was always just like, what is right? I knew like I have a very sensitive nature. I can pick up like changes in the wavelength kind of deal. But my parents, so I would show up at work of being like, oh, I sense that something, but it feels like somebody's hiding from me. And what that ended up materializing in the way I show up for other people is that I am very clear. I tell them where I stand. With me, you know where I stand. You will never have to wonder where I stand. I will tell you if it's good, if it's bad, if like I give it as it is because that's how I deal with my trauma, to the fact that I never knew where other people stood with me. And now that's how I show up. And I'm not saying that that's how anybody here needs to do that, but like realize what are the things that were holding you back and maybe creating defensives for you and how you showed up at work. Because ultimately, again, it's about connection, how we behave as humans, and understanding that, doing the work to know why you show up that way and what you want to do for other people to actually, heal that trauma. It's hard. Again, hard work. Some people are not willing to do the work and it's very confronting. But honestly, it's liberating. Nothing matters anymore. Like even all the stress, I'm like, listen, we're all gonna die one day anyway. So like, why are we worrying so much? Let's just like move on, figure it out. We'll get it done and move on to the next one.
Well, life inspiration for today. Great reminders. Thank you so much, Camila. Sorry. This is a good one. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We do have like one last question. I just want to make sure we do ask it. Beth shared a question in case, Camila, if you still have like 2 more minutes to answer this last question. She asked, can you say more about how you improved the org redesign process? She's been through a few and they've always been so rough. So getting a little bit tactical, if you have some tips on this one.
Yeah, so the way we did the two that we did and how we didn't change much on how we did it, but what we made a point to do is that when we did the first one, we kind of did a retrospective and made notes about the things we wanted to improve for next time. So when the next one happened, it was like, for example, the first one, people were just like, oh my God, I didn't have a chance to like say goodbye to my employees, because what we did, we put them in a private channel that they could talk to each other and with our people ops team, but they couldn't say bye to the rest of the organization. So we're like, okay, we want to make a place where they can talk about, and we created a farewell channel now that like people can go there and say farewell, and like we just made sure to do a retrospective and use the learnings to improve the next one. But even right now, I'm like, I tell people, like, if we have to do this again at Oyster, I need to make sure that it's better than the last one. So I already have these learnings right in my mind that I want to apply if that comes in the future, which honestly, I say, I really hope it doesn't. Right now, we're not working on any of them, but I am thinking about the future, right? It's always about improving it. So the way I would think about as well is like, what are the things that you may have noticed that it's happening organizationally already? It's just like maybe there are conflicts in between teams, or there overlap in like workload. Like making notes of these things happening may help inform how the redesign should happen in the first place. Because oftentimes what I've experienced in the redesigns, like the reorgs that we had, is that the directive came from the seat, like the high level executives, but they didn't have as much information into the functions, and they were relying on only a certain level of management to give that context. But because I do this proactive work of making notes of like, this manager told me this about this, and then like just having kind of like a backlog of items around organizational health and design issues, you can use that to kind of inform the decisions that you make and how you're going to do the reorg the next time around.
That is fantastic. And on that note, Camila, thank you so much for spending an extra minute with us. Like this has been a gold mine of a conversation. I told you this was gonna be a gold mine of a conversation. I was so excited to have you come out here, share your time, your energy, your words of wisdom with us. And on behalf of our Ask a Chief of Staff team, thank you so much for being our guest speaker today. I think we can all give a warm round of applause. Oh, look, the love is coming through the chat. Thanks, everyone. And on that note, Camila, thank you so much. Best of luck with your upcoming offsite. And please, everyone, remember to connect with Camila on her LinkedIn because she is wonderful. And Camila, thank you a million times.
Thank you.
You tell I can't stop. I just
Thank
can't.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good one.
Obrigada.